Hey everybody, this is Brian, and we're here for part two of what may be an extended series, actually, of my top 20 favorite wrestlers. When we were last going at it, I was a little bit cut off by the timer, but what I was talking about was actually the deflation of the meaning of moves and how people have to go to crazier lengths. There's value in a TLC match, there's value in Hell in a Cell, but there might be more value in something that looks crazy but doesn't really deflate the wrestling. I don't really like Elimination Chamber, but I think the idea that there's still the potential for a match in there. Nobody has to jump off the pod or do some crossbody off of the chains like Rob Van Dam would or something like that. But I think that it still creates a believable environment for a match to take place, even though it looks crazy, because people can still actually wrestle in there. It's not something like um, the what was the Great Khali's specialty match? It was so terrible. I don't even really want to remember the name of it. Was it the Punjabi death match or something? It was something that sounded really racially insensitive in hindsight and in retrospect. Not a very good choice considering Khali wasn't even in most of them, and nobody really missed him, his wrestling ability. I think you could stick a cucumber in there and it would out wrestle him. Um, I don't know. He's like wrestles like a petrified stump of like he may as well be replaced by a Duralog. Anyways, enough Kali bashing. Sorry about that. This is meant to be favorite wrestlers, not me going all internet fandom and taking out my frustrations of WWE not listening to us or anything we want. Um, not taking that out on some guy who is just a monster heel reserved for a push so he could be FU'd by Cena or whatever. Um, anyways, but I think they need to kind of de-elevate that a little bit, so actual mat wrestling means something again. And I like how Japan, they keep that style. They keep it mostly slow. As much as I love Mick Foley, I think him and guys like Hardy and guys like Sabu, they're the guys who continually raise the bar on what you have to do to really get a pop. And that's why I think there's a inflation in wrestling, like the wrestling economy has almost crashed because nothing you do means as much as it used to. Um, People have to go farther to more and more unsafe lengths to really get the crowd fired up. Anyways, but that's enough on that. And that's enough on Raven and his amazing legacy of kind of being the voice of the voiceless 10 years before Punk was even out of like ROH. You know, he really kind of I think set the blueprint for that kind of anti-establishment character. And Stone Cold feuding with Vince. CM Punk later also feuding with Vince. Vince really loves to insert himself in the storylines. Um, anyways, enough of that. Let's get to number 6 on here, who's somebody I haven't mentioned at all once on this list so far. CM Punk. I've probably mentioned him more times than anyone who is actually on the list before him. But yeah, this is unranked, so don't get pissed that he's number 6. He's my favorite wrestler, probably behind Rob Van Dam. CM Punk is the modern equivalent of classic talkers such as Chris Jericho, Raven, Stone Cold, Jake the Snake Robert, but really particularly Jake the Snake and Raven, I think. They added the edginess, the anti-establishment feel with Raven, and the darkness that Jake the Snake really pioneered amazingly. I mean, he did that surrounded by an environment that was ridiculously family friendly. To try to do something with that depth and that believability, that sort of darkness, again, to use that term. Jake the Snake, I think, took an incredible risk with his promos being um, so fantastic, but they weren't laden with things like load the spaceship with the rocket fuel and all this crazy stuff. You could actually believe this was a legitimate guy. He looked like someone who'd change your oil. He had a mullet and a porn mustache, and he had a beer gut, and he had a snake, but that snake was mystifying because it's like, is he gonna have his snake eat you or something if you're watching that on TV or even live? Um, why am I talking? But anyways, he laid the foundation for a guy like Punk, who came in the future, had the best title reign of the 2010s before leaving, and then by coming back, making that all less uh, meaningful, I guess. Hopefully, they do something with him and build up to like some amazing WrestleMania match. Hopefully, he's not too beat up from UFC and can actually wrestle still. I hope he wasn't just coming back to say hi to everyone backstage and try to get on better terms with the guys backstage who run everything, you know. Trying to, I don't know. CM Punk's return, I don't really want to talk about that since it hasn't really developed yet. But let's talk about Punk's run, not just on the Indies, but also how he climbed that ladder, and he was pushed down so many times by people telling him that all his tattoos, his skinny frame, his piercings, things like that CM Punk didn't fit the WWE family friendly, John Cena T-shirt selling, Rey Mysterio mask wearing generational image that they were going for in the mid 2000s. But he climbed up that and he became the champion, not just on SmackDown, but they eventually gave him the title. And that whole storyline of him, is he actually going to leave? For some reason, the fans were still, I guess they never believed he was going to leave in reality, but the fans were just crazy over that, and they were really, really, I think, just wanting Punk. They legitimately, not just like, they wanted Daniel Bryan to get a push, but Punk wasn't just a great wrestler, a great talker like Bryan is both, but Punk represented something. He was more than just a dark, homeless guy who looked like Jesus after like a drug bender. He was the guy who could play a perfect heel by seeming condescending based on his unique lifestyle and his intelligence. He could play a perfect heel by playing this kind of almost Jim Jones like character. The Straight Edge Society. He could he could almost do a second kind of take on Stone Cold, but rather than being like, the Texas Rattlesnake, the prototypical image of a badass, was, he almost took that beer can thing that Sandman and ECW had about, smashing the can against your head, and he didn't have the kendo stick, obviously, but I think, yeah, that whole, beer can drinking rattlesnake Texas thing. Punk was more the modern generation, the kind of social media generation, if you will. Punk, though, he really fit with the time, and this is an example of WWE not NOT not. I'm a heavy critic of them a lot of the time, but they didn't fuck this one up. I mean, at least not immediately. And that was probably the best title reign of the decade. And it was so amazing seeing the belt. I never thought they were actually going to give him the belt. I thought he was going to get buried. He was going to get attitude adjustment, or he was going to get a pedigree. They were going to feed him to Undertaker's streak or something. Um, but I think CM Punk really, he wasn't just the voice of the voiceless. He was the voice of the ignored WWE fans who didn't want a bright orange, and I know I'm wearing bright orange, so this is hypocritical, but go Giants anyways. Um, Bright orange John Cena t-shirt. He was the voice of the disgruntled WWE fans, and he was the voice of wrestling fans who wanted something different. And they might not have gotten that from WWE long term, but it sure as hell was probably the best year of wrestling. Punk, his push on Raw. Um, yeah, it was a little bit of a rip off of the Stone Cold thing. That whole, pushing the boss over in his chair and him somehow not firing you, that kind of thing. It was kind of a second take on the Stone Cold thing, but Punk really fit the generation, and I think that was probably the best storyline in WWE since the Attitude Era has ended. So in modern WWE, I think Punk is probably responsible for not just one of the most memorable title reigns, which actually the build to it was actually equal to him having an amazing title reign. It didn't just He wasn't a transitional champion. He didn't get beat by some returning veteran for a cheap pop. Punk actually had a great reign. And so not only did he wrestle a lot of great matches during the last uh, 20, 15 to 20 years. I know he was gone for a while and he had time on the indies and yada yada yada. But Punk really, he was responsible for, in mainstream American wrestling, the best title reign and storyline and some pretty decent in ring work too. Amazing in ring work. Even before he was pushed in ECW, I was always calling for Punk to receive a push. He was one of those guys who I was seeing. I was like, you can immediately see, okay, this guy can do his job better than any of the people that they're putting atop him in the rankings. And I'm glad that was really cathartic. Seeing Punk threatening to leave and actually walk out with the belt, considering that that's happened in the past, like we were all pretty sure it was worked, but still, I mean, Punk, I think, made me believe this, which is really what you want as a fan. Um, he made me believe again, which really made me feel like a kid, which is, you thank people for that youthful feeling at heart, you know. And I think that Punk really brought a sense of legitimacy by incorporating elements of his character and his into his character of his real life self, you know. So there wasn't really just a CM Punk. What you were watching up there really was Phil Brooks. Those were his real life things, and he exaggerated certain elements and played up others. But um, I think that Punk really was not just the best. He was probably the best wrestler of the last 15 years. You know, uh, I mean, since Jericho left for Rock, Rock left for Hollywood, Eddie and Chris both passed in a couple years span. There was a horrible couple year period for wrestling in the mid 2000s. Anyways, enough about that. Let's get to number 7 on here, which is going to be Jeff Hardy. Um, Jeff is sometimes called a spot monkey by critics, and I'll admit he's most famous for the TLC match, but he's become synonymous with it. And if you can become synonymous with a match or a catchphrase or a move, then you've almost secured your own um, what's the word I'm looking for? Your own. You're gonna live on far after your career. You've secured your immortality. You know, can you smell what The Rock is cooking? People still chant "what" during promos that have nothing to do with Stone Cold coming back. He's one of those guys, kind of like Bret Hart, who medically really isn't just kind of waiting 3 years for a big WrestleMania return where he'll hobble around the ring awkwardly in a cane and beat the guy again for a cheap pop that buries someone. Um, you know, I think that Jeff Hardy, if he secured his own immortality in wrestling by becoming synonymous with the TLC, not just him, of course. The Dudleys were synonymous with tables, and Edge and Christian had the concerto. But is anything about those matches really as memorable as those crazy ladder dives that Hardy took? Um, I mentioned earlier in this video and in the last one at the end, the inflation of violence in wrestling. And though I love Jeff, as great and as breathtaking as those spots that he did were, and especially the first time you saw him, like his TLC match against Punk in, I think it was 2009, when he actually went off and he didn't just do some fake dive where, you know how when you're watching a match and you see a guy and he's doing a move out of his normal repertoire of moves, and you're like, okay, he's totally setting up for a counter because that guy's like out of range or something on the top rope, or he's gonna get countered because that's not a move he even does. When you see like it's just too obvious, you know. But when he actually did the swanton um, through the announce table and didn't just miss it, he actually hit Punk and hit him on the stomach and chest pretty hard. It wasn't one of those ones where he's like 3 feet away and then rolled back on when the camera came on. Um, Jeff has done really anything to himself on and off screen, sadly. Um, to have one of the most memorable and beloved careers. One of the guys who I really legitimately think kind of they couldn't turn heel. It would be really hard to have a proper heel Jeff Hardy that wasn't just like a shitty version of like Bray Wyatt that kept the face paint. You know, like, oh, he's from the South and he has face paint, so we should turn him into this weird ripoff of the lady from the second season of Justified, uh, Mama Bennett or whatever her name was. Anyways, but yeah, though Jeff Hardy is a little bit of a spot monkey, he's a little bit complicit in the inflation of violence in wrestling by doing all of these stunts. I think that he was willing to always give a good show, and you always knew he was going to do something crazy. But he really was one of those guys who he cared most about the business. He didn't leave to do some straight to DVD shitty movie. He was one of those guys who's always been there, whether or not his judgment was off screen again. And I'm not trying to be snarky here. I'm just saying that through it all, Jeff Hardy has been one of the most beloved and amazing wrestlers of his generation and of any generation. He's really synonymous with a match type, and I think that with what a staple in WWE and around wrestling, even though it's basically a hardcore match that centers around three different types of weapons. I mean, ECW had hardcore matches that involved all of those weapons and 100 more, but it never felt like a joke like WWE's hardcore division, and they never had to say they were focusing around a couple of different weapons when you knew that they were all going to be there anyways. Um, Nevertheless, though, Jeff really has given his body and a large chunk of his career to make that one of the staple match types in WWE. You know, without Jeff and the Dudleys and Edge and Christian and Matt, we might not have things like Money in the Bank, which is an entire pay-per-view on its own now. I mean, think of the guy who innovated the Royal Rumble concept. The think of the first person who created the King of the Ring, which was very important in the ascension of Steve Austin and other guys kind of almost akin on the push level to an Intercontinental or U.S. Championship reign. Um, think of all of the things which have kind of branched off from this. And Jeff really, I mean, those guys might have been on the table below or rolled off the table or something. But it was really Jeff that made those matches. It's really Jeff that I'll buy those ladder match DVDs for. And it really is Jeff who deserves, out of all of those guys who I respect and love, and if this was a top 50, they'd be here. Um, uh, there's no freebird rule though on a top 20, so it's unfortunately I'm not putting Matt on here. I'm putting just Jeff because I feel like he really was the one that made those matches. Another guy who's also been called a little bit of a spot monkey or a daredevil or a backyard wrestler kind of style, who's number 8 on this list, is going to be Sabu. I just watched earlier one of the most gruesome matches I've actually seen in a really long time. It was from ECW, the DVD, The Most Violent Matches, the one narrated by Paul Heyman. Um, it was a barbed wire match between Terry Funk, who also may be mentioned later, and Sabu. And I think towards the end, Sabu had totally broken character. You could see uh, this really hit home just as a brief personal thing. As a person with epilepsy, you could see Sabu was in such shock that he was like, his hand was legitimately shaking, and he was speaking English. Sabu was supposed to be like a silent, like, I guess, dude from somewhere over in the other part of the world. I don't know. It almost seems like it was started out to be a xenophobia heel kind of thing, but then they turned it into like he's from like Bombay, Michigan or something. They just played up the fact that he was obviously an American, and that broke kayfabe so solidly that they just kind of pushed it aside, focused on his wrestling, and actually just treated it as a little bit of a joke. But Sabu, the things he was willing to do in the ring, like I watched him. It was I think it was the Air Sabu. It was he was doing that move where he sets up a chair. And Sabu in a barbed wire match, by the way, it seems like a stupid idea since most of his offense involves the rope. It would be like doing the 619 in a barbed wire ropes match. Um, Sabu though, he did Air Sabu and he landed straight in the ropes. I think they had to end it premature, kind of like that Angle versus Daniel Puder thing, where it became an actual shoot fight. Um, Sabu, he started, like, you could blatantly hear him on camera speaking English, but it was because I think they had to actually tape him up, and you could see Alfonso taping him up, and well, I guess there will be a part 3, and I'll see you there. Don't want to get cut off by the timer again. We'll just make this a little bit more coarse, I guess. See you there.